Welcome to Talent Titans, the podcast where we bring you entrepreneurs and leaders from the global staffing industry. I'm your host, Suki Sodhi. Now let's jump right on in and welcome today's Titan. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Talent Titans. Today we are talking to another entrepreneur who, interestingly enough, we as a team have had the pleasure of working with when he was a leader in someone else's company. Now he leads his own business. And I'm talking about none other than Gillon Tadman from Penta Search Group. Gillan, welcome.
Thank you, Suki. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So, who is Gillan?
Who's Gillan? That's a big question. So professionally, I've been in the recruitment world for just over 20 years. Short stint in accounting and finance recruitment in London, and then jumped into the world of supply chain management in 2007 with what was then a startup organization. Spent 10 years with them running the European business and then later the North American business. I say all supply chain and manufacturing mid to senior level. And then about 5 years after we moved to North America, we then decided to jump out and set up Penta Search Group, which is my business. So in a nutshell, that's me on a professional level. Outside of work, husband, father of two rapidly growing daughters, and very hands-on from a family perspective. So that keeps me very busy. So, balance between the two, but never a dull moment.
No, it's always that one, especially when you're an entrepreneur, right? Is getting that right balance. And I don't think anybody ever has, quote unquote, the right balance. It's sometimes you have to just step out a little bit just because something else demands it. But let me jump straight in with my first question. So go back 5 years, or may even be 6, because it's when you started thinking about going out on your own. What was the core unmet need that you'd identified in the market that really made you sit down and think, you know what, I'm going to start my own company? And how has that initial vision evolved or deepened over the last number of years in 5 years since you've had your business?
Yeah, well, it's been a little over 5 years, actually. I think to the 2018 was when we officially first started trading. I think in terms of the unmet need, I would answer that question a little bit differently by saying that, going out on my own had always been a plan for me.
Okay.
I come from a family of entrepreneurs, and I always saw that as something I wanted to do in my future. I just wanted to make sure that the timing relative to age and experience would sort of line up in the right way. So I think the timing was right from that perspective. But I think broadly speaking, I felt for a long time since I did my previous company and also since running Penta that there is still a lot of space and a lot of need for a true functional specialist within the supply chain space. Lots of companies touch it from different angles, whether it be under the heading of an industry specialization or whether they put it under a broader heading of industrial style recruitment. I think for us, the nuance has always been and will continue to be that the true understanding of end-to-end supply chain as an entire value chain, married up with a deep understanding of the industry sector within which you're focusing on. I think it's really the marriage of those two specializations that really create the genuine expertise there. The understanding of specific raw materials, the regulated environment that it might be moving in, and just understanding that you can't just pluck somebody out who's got a supply chain director title from any other company and expect to parachute them into another manufacturing business just because the job title is the same. There's a lot more nuance and expertise to it from when you look at it through that lens. So without becoming too scientific about it, I think that's really for us where the expertise is demonstrated, because we do understand the differences in not just the different roles within the supply chain, but how they fit into organizations that sit within different sectors. So as far as the unmet need is concerned, really, I think it's us taking advantage of that expertise, communicating that to existing and potential clients to really illustrate to them, okay, this is how we can move the needle on their talent acquisition and their talent attraction, and most importantly, the effectiveness and accuracy of their own hiring process. And that, of course, is the true value of engaging a specialist. And I think that's always been my passion behind this business, is to actually be that true specialist that gets it right first time. So that I think is always been the opportunity, and very much continues to be. Of course, parameters around that are changing with AI and various other tools that I'm sure we'll talk about today. But fundamentally, that approach to the expertise doesn't change.
No, that's amazing. So interesting. I just learned something about you. You come from a family of entrepreneurs,
Yes.
right? So every founder, every entrepreneur's journey is marked by significant challenges. There's something, right, for all of us. What was a pivotal moment or a major hurdle in Penta's early years? I think I know the answer, but that might be too much of an obvious answer, so I won't say what I'm thinking, particularly related to establishing your expertise in that global recruitment space. And what key lessons did you personally take away from that has really helped you shape yourself as a leader and how your business is run today?
Sure. Well, I mean, I suspect the obvious answer that you're thinking of course, was going into a global pandemic.
Just as you launched.
24 yeah. months after we kind of launched, which was interesting. I mean, it certainly threw a curveball for lots of reasons. I mean, it was an unknown for all of us, and we were about to embark on our first sort of major sort of internal growth moves with making several hires, which we then immediately I put them on pause because of course we didn't know what was going on. So I think that was really the first major challenge in the business. I mean, the couple of years before that, it was as expected. So we had to navigate that and understand what that meant for different clients in different spaces. As luck would have it, we fared very well during the pandemic. I think because of the industry sectors that we do a lot of recruitment into, particularly around life sciences, chemical manufacturing, and the more sort of essential product end of CPG, for example. Yep. So that carried us through well. Putting that aside, because I mean, that was a challenge for everybody for various reasons. I would say the other challenge that we faced, less and less so as time goes on, but Penta Search Group, of course, was my idea. It was my inception as a business. It was not a brand name that was out there. So I used to have a lot of conversations with people that say, well, look, Penta Search Group is new to the market, but I am not. I've been in the supply chain space, in equal measure in both Europe and North America since 2007. And really that enabled us to carry a lot of clients forward because I was known to a large number of senior professionals in the procurement and supply chain space that were happy to continue working with me, take calls, or even if it was an early conversation, very quickly I was able to establish that track record through conversation, demonstrating knowledge, but also the fact that I was known to a large number of other people. Inevitably, those networks overlapped. So I think, to keep this answer reasonably short, I would say it's really just establishing the brand and understanding that really you're building a pitch almost from scratch at that point. You're saying, yes, this is the company, this is what we do. Let's demonstrate track record. Let's demonstrate our understanding. And then once you get that conversation down pat, as it were, you can very quickly start to establish that you do understand what you're talking about. And then, of course, at that stage, opening the door to new business opportunities, new relationships becomes a little bit more straightforward. I think they're probably the two biggest challenges. I mean, of course, there's a shopping list of others that we could go through, but they're the ones that particularly stand out.
Did people actually care? The people that were in your network, those potential clients and candidates that were already, they knew Gillan, right? They've known Gillan for like 5, 6, 7 years. Did they actually care that now you are no longer with this company, but you are over here? So in my mind, I wouldn't care where you are because I know your expertise. I know what you can deliver. I know what you've delivered for me in the past. I should imagine people weren't really that concerned because you stayed in your lane. You didn't suddenly go from supply chain to accounting and finance.
Yeah.
Right. You had that brand recognition as Gillan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
No, look, no, the short answer is no, they didn't care. And in fact, obviously when I left my previous organization, there was a period of non-compete where I had to be very careful. And I got a lot of phone calls during that time saying, I understand you've left. Where are you going? What are you doing? Which was nice. And a lot of people quite concerned to make sure that nothing had gone wrong, which was nice. And so I sort of explained to them that I was leaving, starting my own business, and that I would be in touch at the appropriate time when my non-compete had expired. But I mean, I was relatively confident that, strong clients, long-standing clients would probably follow me at the, when I was able to do so, because when you're building any desk, within any organization, it's a bit of a cliche, but you always talk about building it as if it were your own business and building the brand of, Joe Smith Incorporated, even if you're operating under a broader umbrella. And so with those relationships being long-standing, very deep, that really created a strong foundation from which to build a business. So the short answer is no, people didn't care. And even those that didn't necessarily know me very well, once you establish that you understand their world, their functional expertise, their industry, you're able to immediately stand out from the crowd anyway, from a large percentage of the other calls and emails that they'll get, because you're approaching it with a confidence and a vernacular and a fluency to what they do in a way that just naturally those inflections build confidence and build credibility. So it was never a hurdle that we weren't going to overcome. It's just down to each individual that you talk to as to whether or not that individual decides to take a different approach because you don't have a certain brand name behind you, or it is a newer company. I think if I tried to switch functions and go from, as you say, from supply chain into finance and accountancy, it would have been a very different type of challenge. And ultimately that would have been, in my opinion, a foolish move anyway. I mean, I'd spent 10, nearly 11 years building a professional network and a very successful track record in the supply chain space. Why would you throw that out the window, unless of course you're desperately unhappy recruiting in that space, which I wasn't. I've always deeply enjoyed recruiting in the supply chain world, and that was obviously part of the reason for carrying on doing it under my own umbrella, as it were.
Yeah. You said something which I was just like, this is great. The way you handled your clients from your previous company.
Yeah.
Right? You were very intentional about respecting your previous employer.
Yep.
Because although you'd left, you'd worked with them for 10 whatever years. Yeah. And that just speaks to, for me, that was really refreshing to hear, because it speaks to the integrity of the business. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
so I think that's...
I worked for that organization for a long time. Deep respect for the people that run that business, and former colleagues, friends that were still there. I'm only able to do what I'm doing today because of the experience that I gained at that organization. And I'll always be deeply grateful for that. And that remains the case today. There were pain points, as there always inevitably are with any business, but very grateful for that. So I didn't want to have that, I didn't want to tar myself with that brush by cutting a corner off a non-compete. And there was more than enough for me to be getting on with during the first 6 months anyway, not to mention the fact that my wife and I just had our second baby just as that business kicked off as well. So I had things going on at home, which was, needed time and attention. But no, I wanted to play it straight. And I also knew they'd be watching as well. So, it was a case of, integrity and also, there's no excuse for doing that, in my opinion, particularly when you've been so deeply involved with an organization. I didn't want to, as I say, tar myself with that brush. I didn't want to put myself in a difficult position. And ultimately I had plenty of other things that I could do, lots of other business to go after. And in some ways, actually, it was a good thing, because it enabled me to build business in new places, because I couldn't build business in places that I did know for 6 months, which meant that when those other clients did come back online, the clients I'd worked with previously, my client list, of course, was twice as long, because I'd spent 6 months building business in other places. So, it sort of forced me into new business development mode, as opposed to just relying on prior relationships, which I don't think anybody in this industry would tell you is a bad thing. So yes, it was a very deliberate and very honest, decision to approach it in that way.
I speak to so many people that go out on their own, and part of their business kickoff plan is, well, I know that client's coming, that client's coming, that client's coming, right? And then when that client doesn't come, or that client comes and then goes elsewhere or whatever, and then they're left, I've got to get into cold calling mode. So yours was a reverse. You were like, okay, if they come, that's icing on the cake. And plus, I actually think, I don't know if this is true or not, but certainly this is the way I look at it. If I'm working with a supplier, whether it's a recruitment partner or a tech, whatever, and over here today you're telling me, oh my God, this company is great, this piece of technology is amazing, buy this. And then tomorrow you call me up and say, actually, this technology is even better. I'm left because I give that as an example because that happened to me a couple of months ago. And I remember sitting there, well, hold on a second. You just sold me a 4-year contract because that was the best. Now, 6 months later, you're telling me, actually, no, this is the best, right? So I do, and it just speaks to the core ethics, right? So anyhow, it segues us nicely into, you said you had to do business development and what have you into new territories, new regions. Building true expertise in that global supply chain vertical requires that deep understanding of diverse markets, regulations, and talent pool. What were some of the strategies or even investments that you personally championed to develop Penta's global outreach, specialization, the knowledge in this field?
Look, I think putting aside technology investments for a second, because that's a whole other topic. I think when we're going into any market, right? Let's say you're going to go into the pharmaceutical market and you're going to focus on procurement talent, for instance. The key really is ultimately covering as much ground as you can as it relates to talking to individuals. You can do marketing campaigns of varying descriptions, but at the end of the day, we are in a relationship-driven business, and when you want to work, particularly at the senior end of the scale, there is a lot of trust that is involved in that decision to engage you on any level. Typically, particularly if you want good quality work with good quality clients. So the strategy is quite simple, and it hasn't changed all that much over the years that we've all been doing this, is that you get out and you talk to senior people, heads of function, and you build a relationship with those individuals. Different ways of building that relationship, of course, but ultimately it comes down to building relationships with the key decision makers within the organizations that you are targeting to work with. There is no replacement for that outreach. There are various tools that enable you to scale your initial communication with those individuals, but there is no replacement for conversation, for meetings like this. I mean, we're doing a podcast today, which is slightly different, but fundamentally I spend the large majority of my days talking to people on a screen like this, rather than trying to have a phone call or anything else, because it creates that personal connection, that face-to-face interaction. And so ultimately, coming back to your question, the strategy is just to make sure that you know who your target client looks like, whether it's a specific company or a company profile, companies that fit a certain shape and size and structure, however you want to define it. And then ultimately you identify the key individuals within those organizations that you need to be speaking with, and you target them. It's quite straightforward. That much about recruitment has not changed. As I say, lots of tools that can enable the outreach to happen a little bit more effectively so that you're not spending as much of your day crafting emails. The strategy from that perspective is exactly the same.
I get it. Every industry, you got to be able to talk. Nobody's going to trust you with their career if you're a candidate. If you're a hiring company, nobody's going to trust you with their internal talent if they haven't built that relationship. You haven't demonstrated that value. So tell me about the kind of people you're hiring now as you grow your team.
So for us, hiring internally, what I've learned over the years, running teams in other businesses and running this business, is that particularly for the type of market, the type of organizations that we're recruiting, when you're in a client-facing role, I think experience and tenure speaks volumes to the target client base, target candidate base that we're talking. And you have to bear in mind that at the level we're recruiting at, there is very rarely a difference in level between the people that we are recruiting into opportunities and the people that we are speaking to about recruitment, unless you get right up to the C-suite level. So, as the saying goes, clients are candidates, candidates are clients. But I think in order to build the credibility with them, first of all, with LinkedIn and various other sort of social media tools that enable us as recruiters to showcase our own experience and expertise, it enables people to do their research. Seeing individuals with experience and tenure is important to them. I think it's important to know that, in my opinion, you get less engagement when you've got slightly less experience, or certainly if you're jumping around different companies a lot of the time, or bouncing between different functional expertise, going from accounting and finance, then into marketing, then suddenly you decide to have a go at supply chain. There's a very strong indicators that you get a much higher engagement when you're coming to the table with a little bit more experience and time in that function, or at least in the industry sector within that individual sits. So bringing that back to what we're hiring, it's really that profile, right? It's bringing people in that have a track record, at least of 4 or 5 years within the supply chain management. So the full value chain. So it could be procurement, supply chain, could be manufacturing and engineering within a regulated industry. Doesn't matter what regulated industry, whether it's life sciences, chemicals, CPG, or automotive, aerospace, for example. But as long as you've got that experience and that understanding, that's what we're hiring, because it's going to enable you to just gain that much more credibility, get that much more traction with the target client base that you're pursuing. Any knowledge gaps that exist as it relates to our particular business, our processes, systems, so on and so forth, that's a very teachable knowledge gap to bridge. It's the other piece that we need people to bring as it relates to that functional and or sectoral experience. Beyond that, it's the usual things that we're looking for in this business. It's that drive, that autonomous, self-driven, self-motivated desire to be successful, very coachable personalities, and people that want to be part of a team that's building something, that's growing something. That sort of work ethic is not something that can be taught. You either bring that or you don't. But as far as the other pieces are concerned, as I say, that supply chain experience within regulated environments, that's really a must-have for us, because it ensures that we bring people in that have got a solid foundation from which we can build.
I really like this, what you're saying there, because we're not saying no to inexperienced people. Your model is, my clients and your business strategy, your hiring strategy is, no, when a client or a candidate is talking to a employee of Penta, that employee understands their world in depth. And I think that's a real unique value for the client and the candidate, because the last thing, especially a senior candidate, is going to want to do is explain to somebody like me, for argument's sake, although I have tons of experience in this industry, not supply chain. So they don't want to have to explain to me what they do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, certainly for us at the moment, as we are scaling, it's important that we bring that level of expertise into the business now. Certainly as I look into the future of the business, I would like to get us to a point where we can start to home grow some talent that we bring in at a more junior level. I think that's essential for any growing organization, is to have that capability to bring those people in and coach them up from a grassroots level. But you also need to, in order to do those individuals justice and ensure the success of those people, you need to have a framework and a structure that, as near as damn it, guarantees their success, short of them deciding not to do the work. Frankly, we're not in that position at the moment. That's something that we're looking at for probably 2-3 years down the line. Right now, we need the bench strength that's going to enable us to continue the current growth curve that we're on and continue the success that we've been enjoying at the moment, without it pulling too much distraction or too much resource from the team today, who are already very busy with a heavy workload, I'm pleased to say. But with that heavy workload, there's now a responsibility to deliver. And what we don't want to be doing is diluting the resource in the business for the wrong reasons at the moment. So we need to be very careful about what order we hire certain profiles into the business.
I love this because you're being very intentional with your hiring.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very intentional. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a complete work from home.
Yes, we are. So we used to have an office space, and then obviously, the pandemic came along and everybody went home. And ultimately, it didn't alter anything for us as far as performance is concerned. If anything, it elevated culture and happiness in the business in a way that I'd never experienced before. I mean, none of us had ever sort of really had the
Yeah,
opportunity to work
we're
from
all
home
used
on
to
a regular
5 days
basis
in the
before.
office. Yeah,
Exactly. And I think for us, there was no real value of having an office in the traditional sense because, even if we're, in our downtown Vancouver office, for example, in Canada, we're only bringing people in because that was just how everybody operated in that moment in time. But when you looked at where our clients were in North America, for example, I always say that, our clients in the US are in all four corners and everywhere in between, and our candidate base is the same. So ultimately, we were already working remotely from our clients and candidates. It was just we were choosing to all get in the same room to do it. So when the pandemic came through, everybody was happy. We had a meeting as a team, and everybody was very happy working from home and wanted to continue doing so. So we extended out that period of time and kept an eye on, okay, well, things are going well. Let's make sure that continues to be the case. And if anything, performance did very noticeably continue to improve. There was no loss of engagement. There was no loss of culture in the business. And we just had to make sure that our interactions as a team were quite deliberate. If you're trying to build a team and you're trying to build culture and you're doing it on a remote platform, I've just learned over the years that you have to be a lot more deliberate in those interactions, so that people aren't just suddenly devolving their relationship to email or text message. So we use Microsoft Teams and do a video conversation for literally almost every interaction in the business to make sure we get that interaction. And then we do get together, at various points in the year. I travel around to see the team. They sometimes come to me. We do, the high performers trip in January, first week of January every year. We do the high performers trip down to Mexico, which is always fun. But there are also points during the year where we'll get together, whether I'm going to see my team on the East Coast or going back to London to see the guys there. So there are still those team bonding events. There's still those opportunities to get together and work as a group. And then what we find is that locally, where we've got people clustered together in, say, Toronto or London, for example, those guys naturally will get together once every couple of weeks to do some work together in an office, go for lunch, go for drinks, whatever it might be. So we really encourage that. We just don't mandate that you have to go to a specific office X number of days a week. And at the moment, that works well for us.
Do you think that's because it's working well because of how intentional you are with your hiring?
Yes,
The hiring
absolutely.
profile.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think we're hiring people that are to some degree into their career. They've got personal circumstances outside of work where that flexibility really benefits them, particularly if they've got family or other commitments. And ultimately, my leadership style and the way I set my stall out when we're talking to people is that we will teach the process and the systems that we want people to work to in the business. And then we talk about what the desired outcomes are and the expectations around that. How they achieve that in the middle, ultimately, we pass that back to them to say, look, these are the processes, these are the systems, these are the desired outcomes. The responsibility on you now is to deliver. Now, that's not to say we wash our hands and hope for the best. Clearly, that's not the case. But, we don't feel the need to, figuratively or otherwise, be stood over people's shoulders watching every aspect of them doing the job. If I feel the need to do that, then I have to question whether I've hired the right individual into the business. So we create a lot of, we provide a lot of autonomy and we provide a lot of trust out of the gate. But in order to do that and feel confident making that decision, getting the target profile of the individual we bring into the business is absolutely essential. But the outcomes, when you get that right, of course, are great for everybody.
Yeah, I think in our industry, and I know it's a generalizing, sweeping statement, but I still think for the most part it's true. We've kind of not quite wrapped our head around that 100% remote, not quote unquote micromanaging. And so it's amazing when I hear success stories like this. It can be done because you went from, as you said, everybody had to be in that Vancouver office because that was how we all done it.
Yeah, very much so.
Right? It's how we all done it. And we're seeing a big shift where people, certainly here in Toronto, actually more, even wider than that, are starting to say, no, we want people in the office 4 days a week. There's one that's 5 days a week. And I'm like, I just can't see how you're going to attract great talent 5 days a week. We're a hybrid model. So like yourself, originally, I had no intention when the lease came up. No, just going to get rid of it, do all work from home. But my guys wanted to come back to the office.
Yeah.
And it's funny because yesterday we were having a conversation because 3 of us live north of the city. And they were like, well, we should move office north of the city. And I was like, no, we should all work from home. And one of my guys said, the downtown guy's like, oh no, I need an office to come to. So it's really trying to finding that right balance, right? But a lot of companies are going back to mandating. There's one company who shall name nameless, one of the big internationals. They mandate Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the office, right? And originally I was like, why would you do that? Because I go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's because they're like, well, Mondays a need to be in the office, and Friday people kick off early. We want them to be in the office, and that becomes a trust issue. Why are you hiring those people?
It does raise some questions that could be considered problematic if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
Look, I think mandating, in a world that is post-COVID, I think mandating in office or even mandating you can only work remote could run you into some sort of issue. And at the moment, we don't have regular office space that we use. The way I've approached it, I mean, clearly the working from home, the working remotely thing for us, that's a given and that's working.
Yep.
If we end up in a situation, I've said this to all of my teams and continue to drive this message, is that let's say, our group in London, for example, all say, London and surrounding areas, all say, look, we would like an office that we can go to on a regular basis. And you've got a group of people in a location that want that. Then I've said, no problem at all. We can make that happen. We have the resources to be able to put that in place very, very quickly, whether it's a Regis or a WeWork scenario or something a little bit more, kind of branded and permanent. It's very easy. So I really put it into the hands of the individual teams and the people running those teams to say, look, tell me what you want. How do you want to run your teams? What do your people want? My job is to enable that, not to stand in the way of that. So I think, mandating entirely one way or the other, I think in a post-COVID world, whatever language you want to use, I think could run you into problems. At the same time, you're never going to make everybody happy. There will be people that will not want to work in a business that is remote because they are, single, living on their own, and they want that interaction. Or some people just have a very busy house. They don't have the space for a quiet office. And the last thing they need is, the children running through the door, screaming and shouting when they're on a video call with a client. Doesn't matter what the motivation is. So for me, it's about listening to our people and saying, look, what do you want? What do you need? And then looking at how we provide for that. Ultimately, my goal is to build a successful, happy team where everybody is getting out of this, what they're looking to achieve. And so my job as the leader is to just make sure that they've got the tools and the infrastructure to ensure that happens.
I absolutely love that. And this nicely, because I know we're coming up to time, nicely segues me back to the business. What's the next 24, 36, actually 5 years? What is Penta going to look like? How's the business going to have evolved? What are you seeing? Is there something coming down the supply chain industry that you're like, this is going to be a disruptor? What's happening? Tell me about that crystal ball.
From an industry standpoint or a sector standpoint, I think probably AI is the big thing that everybody's looking at right now. It's a bit of a buzzword. I'm not going to sit here and say that we really understand it to any great depth at the moment. I think we're trying to keep up with the information and the news that's coming out. And it comes back to, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it comes back to just talking to your clients, staying close to them, understanding what their agenda is, how they're adopting AI or other technologies that are coming into play and keeping up with that. as it relates to Penta's goals and what we're doing, I mean, really the buzzword at the moment is growth. Now, that doesn't just mean arbitrarily adding headcount. Headcount in isolation is a very weak indicator of growth within any organization. There is a certain balance of headcount for sure, but ultimately you've got to look at a number of other metrics. And we're a very data-driven business, looking at, things like the number of clients that are active, the job flow, and the diversification of that as well. I mean, I've always said to my teams that having a large number of jobs is great, but if it's only with a couple of clients, then your risk value is off the charts. So you've got to make sure you sort of look at your desk almost as as a chart where you've got the number of requisitions along one axis, and then you've got the number of clients there spread across another, and you want there to be a balance of both. So, for us, as we measure the success of Penta and we measure the ongoing growth, I'm really looking at where that success is coming from. Job flow, the number of clients, and also then the level and type of business that we're getting through. So for us, it's about making sure that we continue to increase the volume of high-value clients, high-value jobs that we've got, and then, of course, tracking the real metrics, which is not just top line, but it's also your bottom line, EBITDA and other metrics relate to that. So for us, it's the mission is probably longer term in just increasing market share, both within North America and Europe, and then being able to step back and say, right, have we increased our market share? If so, by how much? How have revenues increased year over year? And making sure we see that ongoing growth. I'm not building a business that's then going to be attempted to be flipped and sold in the next 5 years. This is a longer term mission than that. So for us, it's just about being better year over year and seeing growth that's reflective in the right metrics.
So I love that, because a lot of people assume that entrepreneurs, we create businesses because, we want to be sold in 5 years. If that's your dream, fantastic, but that's not everybody's. So I know we're coming up to time, but I've got one final question for you. I think it's the final one. For entrepreneurs that are listening to this, so they run their own agencies, or they're about to want to go out on their own, what is the one or two piece of advice that you're really going to give them? Gosh,
there's lots of things that I've learned. I would say that the biggest piece of advice is just in the sort of first couple of years at least, keep it simple, right? You're going out into a business that presumably you're staying within your chosen market. So keep it simple and run it by the numbers. Run the business as if you were running your desk at the previous organization. Yes, you are going to have other distractions that come with running a business. If you have the capability and the budget, outsource as much of the sort of quote unquote back office stuff as you can, because that will be the biggest time suck that will come into play. And you can spend more time worrying about your tax planning or your marketing or anything else. And before you know it, you've taken on too much water and you've sunk. So outsource all of that, get a strategy in place for that upfront before you actually start sort of jumping into that business. And then just get your head down and run that business as if it were an individual desk, and you don't have to worry about those things for the first 2 years. Get some momentum, get some track record under your belt, bank some cash, right? Just put away a war chest so that you're good for 6, 12 months if needs be, and then start looking at how you scale. And I say that from experience. We came out of the gates pretty hot in the first couple of years, and did quite deliberately then have to sort of scale it back a little bit, because we probably took on a little bit more than we could chew. And I'm happy to throw my hands up to that. And so don't make that mistake. Be patient, build yourself the right foundation by just focusing on the same things that you would have done when you're starting a desk anywhere else. When you've got a head of steam, then that's where you can afford yourself a little bit of time, probably a little bit of budget to then start kind of putting these other mechanisms in place. Unless, of course, you're coming at it and you've got a big angel investor or something who's going to throw a load of money at you, and you're looking at a longer term climb out for ROI, in which case, different conversation, have at it. But if you're doing it on more of a modest budget, then that would be probably the main piece of advice that I would give at that point.
That's great advice. At the Canadian Staffing Summit this year, we had the small business panel. And funny enough, one of my clients that was on that from back, he said exactly the same. Everybody was like, grow, grow, grow. So they were growing. And suddenly then they realized they'd grown too fast. So then they had to scale it back. So that's something quite a few entrepreneurs that I've spoken to have said if they were doing it again, they'd be like, hang on a second, why am I growing? Am I growing because that's exactly what I need to do? Or is that, quote unquote, ego? Am I running before I can walk type of thing? This is amazing. Gillan, thank you ever so much for your time. Is there any passing comments that you want to mention that we haven't got round to?
I don't think so. We've covered a lot of ground today. So thank you for the opportunity to join me on the podcast. It's been fun.
Oh, you're welcome. Look, thank you ever so much for your time, and I will speak to you later.
Lovely.
Bye
Thanks
for
a
now.
lot. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Talent Titans, brought to you by Recruitment Professional Forum, where they're building a grassroots community for professionals and leaders in the recruitment industry to collaborate, advocate, and advance the profession. If you liked or were inspired by what you heard, make sure to follow, subscribe, and even leave a review. It lets more talented recruiters like you find the show. Until next time, keep on being a talent titan.